Well, Jane, first off, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me to come chat whiskey.
Chatting whiskey is what we do best. Well, it's what we like to think we do best anyway. Jay, we do it pretty good, I think, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Jane, walk us through the earliest days of your whiskey world. What kind of got you into it, whether it was a pour when you were younger, whether it was a awful experience with something in college that pushed you away from it and you came back to it? What was it that kind of got you onto the path?
I don't know that I ever had a choice. I grew up in Kentucky, and bourbon is queen or king, however you want to say it. So I drank Jim Beam or Old Crow all through college, depending on what part of the month and how much money I had. And then out of school, you kind of graduated, right? You started drinking Makers and kind of Woodford post-college. The first bourbon I ever drank was Wild Turkey 101. It still holds a very near and dear place in my heart. And then actually, I always tell people, it's funny, I truly fell in love with bourbon living in Japan. I taught English as a second language in Japan for 2 years right out of college. And I was making money, and the bourbon bars there were just unbelievable. And you would see all these exports that we didn't have in Kentucky. Like, I had never heard of Four Roses. I had never heard of, a lot of these products that you would see, these weird Blantons that I hadn't seen before. And that was where I really fell in love with bourbon and kind of started drinking it, not in a serious way, but in a more real way. And then, so I grew up in a dry town. So my family, I always thought my family were teetotalers. They just were closet whiskey drinkers. I don't remember the day that it was like, oh, I love this. It just was kind of always there.
I wanted to just touch on the Japanese side of it real quick, because that's such an interesting piece of how bourbon got to where it is right now. Was there something that while you were there, you're like, holy shit, I've never heard of Blanton's Red, or, whatever it is? Was there like any one product that you could pick out that really kind of put a fire under you?
I remember, because like I said, Wild Turkey was something that I had started on, and then you would see these weird age-stated Wild Turkeys, and then actually Maker's Mark Black was something that, Maker's was what my brother and his friends drank at tailgates, and that was kind of the family. My stepdad drank it. My dad was a Wild Turkey. Even it took Maker's 46 to get my dad off Wild Turkey to Maker's. Like, even when Maker's was keeping the lights on in my house, my dad was like, nope. And so 46 was finally what won him over. But yeah, I mean, I think those were the two to stand out. And like I said, I didn't know what Four Roses was. And they had a plethora of different products. Blanton's Gold, Blanton's Silver. Like, it was like a totally different bourbon bar than what you would see back home. It was very bizarre. And I didn't understand the industry enough to understand why that was. I just thought I wasn't drinking in the right bars back home. So it was, it was really interesting.
Okay. I'd like to pivot a little bit then. So we go Japan, drinking bourbon. Clearly, you have a much different position now in life. And I'm curious, what bridges that gap? So what was it a pretty direct line of sight from leaving Japan, coming back and working at Makers? Or how did you get in the door? And most importantly, how did you get to where you are today?
So my mom is relentlessly aggressive. So I came home from living abroad, backpacking, and was saving money, like sleeping on my mom and stepdad's couch. And I wake up one morning and there's like a Post-it note on my head. And my mom had cut out a newspaper clipping that Maker's Mark was hiring an event coordinator. And it was a very not so subtle, like, get off your ass and go get a job. And so, yeah, because I was just home for a friend's wedding. I was going to save money and I was going to move to New Zealand and be a rafting guide. Like, that was the plan. So to appease my mom, I got my resume together. I wrote a cover letter and I kicked it off with, "Dear Mr. Samuels, I don't want this job." And then I went into this whole pitching. I had been traveling. I'm a born and bred Kentucky girl. I love bourbon. I love the history of it. I love that it's such a rich part of our heritage here in Kentucky and even in the United States. So I pitched this whole, here's the job you should give me. And they called. And they said, it's so funny, we've quietly been looking to hire someone local and train them up as a bourbon specialist and send them out into the world to start introducing people to Maker's Mark outside of the United States. Would you be willing to come in and meet with Rob Samuels, who, is seventh, sixth generation, depending on what lineage you are, and talk to him? And I did. And that kicked off, that was almost 15 years ago. So from there, it's been a zigzag. My careers, I love the industry. I love other than like the legal side and the finance side. And even the finance, I love every single part of our industry. I love the sales. I love the marketing. I love the juice. So I have been in a lot of different things. And then ultimately I wanted to make whiskey. I wanted to be the person that decided what liquid got put in the bottle. And I just never stopped nagging until they let me do that, basically.
The Maker's Ambassador program itself, is that sort of something that evolved from positions like yours when you were originally hired there? Like, hey, look, we really have built this following. We want to grow this more. And how can we do that aside from get people that are excited about the product to talk about it to their friends? Is that something that you could see growing in that same position that you sort of did, where you kind of came in and they wanted you to get the word out?
No, it was the opposite. It's interesting. The ambassador program really kind of came about in a very organic way. I will say Bill Samuels Jr. was the original bourbon ambassador. If you were to go ask, every distillery, like, who are the people that got bourbon where it is, I think they would tell you him with Booker Noe and Jimmy Russell, and they hit the streets, right? No one cared about bourbon. No one wanted bourbon. And they were just out there, kind of scrappy and hawking at a drink at a time. And so really how the ambassador program came about, it all really started when Maker's Mark ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in the early 80s. And at that point, we weren't really distributed outside of the state of Kentucky. And suddenly this teeny tiny bourbon brand's on the front fold of the Wall Street Journal. First time a privately held company had been on the front fold. And Bill tells his dad, I think we better get a second phone line. It was just the two of them in the office. And they answer something like 30,000 calls and I don't know how many letters over the next 12 months. And they realize people love to hear from them. And so they did that for years. And they had these people in these communities that just loved the brand. And when they would go to Tampa, they would see these people. Or when they would go to Maine, they would see these other people. And so it kind of formed naturally over 2 decades of just them having relationships directly with consumers. And so it's interesting because, now these marketing and these rewards programs, everybody has, right from my grocery store to my haircut place to my daycare, whatever. But they really were ahead of their time. And it was really, it wasn't something that was contrived. It was something that was happening. And so they decided to bring all these people in. And I was an ambassador before I worked for the brand. It's everybody's got a Maker's Mark story, and mine, was nothing to do with working there. It came before that. So it's interesting when you meet people and they tell you their stories about how the brand's been a part of their life. So our ambassadors are very near and dear to us as a brand.
As far as I understand it, you have been at Maker's for some time, and I believe, and forgive me if you've already celebrated, but you have your 15th anniversary coming up.
Yeah.
That's when specifically? That's got to be the next couple of months, right? March. All right. So with your 15-year anniversary coming up, I mean, that's a hell of a tenure, especially in, these days. It's very, we see personnel are hopping from distillery to distillery all the time, and it usually makes the news. But Over the last 15 years, what's the most notable way that you've seen Maker's Mark grow other than just a sheer increase in volume?
I mean, I think what I do, the innovation. For 50 years, we did one thing. And I don't think it's because we couldn't do anything else or didn't want to do anything else. I think it's no one's drinking bourbon. Why are you going to make a different bourbon? So we were very lucky. I mean, we've sold every drop we've made since the early 80s, thanks to that article we talked about, right? So I think what has been really interesting in my tenure is I've gotten to be a part of one of the most exciting times in bourbon history. I think when you look back on those big bourbon booms, the last 10 years has been unbelievable. What's happened to the American whiskey landscape and how it's changed. So I think, to me, the way the brand's grown has really been about how do we innovate in a way that stays true to us, is truly pioneering, where we're not just trend chasing. It's really about telling our stories and showing liquids that we're proud of that maybe people don't understand. 46. What do you mean you're using staves and French oak and the name's really stupid and we don't get it, right? But the whiskey tastes great, and here's why it tastes great. So I think, the brand is really, we've taken our time to be thoughtful about how we're innovating. And with my job, we're not an industry that can really be about fads, because fads change so quickly, and that we plan in decades, right? Like me planning in a next year, that's not a thing in whiskey. So, that to me is really, I think we've been really thoughtful, and we've been, from my standpoint, I still have to look myself in the mirror every morning and go, I'm not screwing up the 70-year legacy brand that this husband and wife put all their heart and soul and savings into, right? Like so it's really, it's been interesting to watch the brand grow through this landscape and stay relevant.
As a director of innovation there at Makers, what is sort of your day-to-day, like, or what does maybe a week look like for you?
I mean, it's morning start with nose in the glass. So I try to get all my tastings done before lunchtime. Once I eat, I'm kind of done for the day. I get too distracted by other things. So usually in the morning, Beth Buckner, who's our innovation manager, she came over and joined me 2 years ago from Quality. So we spend the mornings, we start with classic. Everything starts, we own all of the formulation and guardianship of all 2.5 million cases of Maker's Mark. So we're working closely on, we have 49 warehouses. We're looking at maturation. We're looking at how things are going. And then usually from there, we'll move into innovation tastings. Wednesdays, I have a standing meeting with Independent Stave Company, who's our cooperage, Andrew Webrink, who's their director of innovation. Most Wednesdays, I see him around 10 a.m. If he's in town. Denny Potter usually comes over in the afternoon, our master distiller. We kind of go through what's been happening. I'll have meetings with marketing teams to kind of understand where we are. I don't run the packaging, but I make sure the packaging is kind of in the spirit of what we're doing from the distillery. And then, there's stuff like this, this is my Monday night. So it really depends, but most days are looking at, it's liquid. I would say 50% of my job. I meet with farmers. I meet with, maltsters. I mean, I handle with our team, a lot of smart people, but where we're procuring stuff, we work with the University of Kentucky. We're planning 23 different wheat trials and barley trials on the property every year. And we're working with the soil science. I mean, so it really is, there's a large gamut, which is good. I get bored easily. So every day is different.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I wouldn't have imagined that you were that hands-on with that many different aspects of the business. We spoke about the Oak Genome Project and what you guys are doing with UK, and it seemed like really cool stuff that I didn't really have my mind wrapped around, that Makers was doing so much with not just the the on-premise agriculture, but the entire conservation side of it too. It's really impressive stuff that, as a brand, I think you guys are doing that kind of goes unnoticed a lot of times in the bourbon industry.
It's so funny because, you know, obviously Jason Nally and we have a really strong team that thinks about sustainability and they live it and they breathe it. I'm a little more pragmatic, I guess. To me, it just makes good business sense. When you're an agricultural product, if you don't take care of the land, you're not going to have a product. So to me, it seems very practical to want to take care. And I think for me, the Genome Project and where that can go, and a lot of the work we're doing on looking at how has wheat changed fundamentally for the last 70 years based on as it's become more yield driven? Have you lost flavor along the way? My whole world is flavor. So I spend all day, every day diving into where flavor comes from, whether it's a 200-year-old French oak tree or some corn that Ronnie Mattingly grew down the road, or whether it's our entry proof. We just finished an 8-year entry proof experiment studying the role entry proof plays on the taste profile of a whiskey, or fermentation times, or I mean, you name it. We are trying to isolate to understand all the flavor levers throughout these processes that we've used for 70 years. Because a lot of times distillers, things get passed down generation and no one ever stops and goes, why do we do this? Why does this matter? And so why is this? And it's charming when people go, well, I don't know, that's how we've always done it. Great, but let's maybe like pressure test to see what's actually happening here. So that's really what my department does, is we just study where flavor comes from and figure out how to get more of it in a way that works for us.
Embracing whiskey science, I think, is one of my favorite parts about the whiskey industry. And it does kill me every now and then. I'm at a distillery and I go, oh, why do you do this? Why are you doing this the specific way? And the guide goes, well, it's been working for the last, I don't know, insert 60, 70, 90 years. Like, we can't change it now. And I'm like, but why? And they're like, well, it's just always worked. So I really appreciate people who approach it as, as chemistry, as many of the big houses are doing. Like, it's an agricultural product and you need to understand chemistry to get repeatable, good bourbon that's consistent. But I think that ties nicely into the innovation side too. Like, you need to understand where you're going. And with the advent of the new wood finishing series, I'm curious, how did that come to Maker's Mark? Like, who was responsible for saying, hey guys, let's start this crazy project? And was it supposed to be just a year or two thing to see if you'd catch on, or did you guys have a big master plan, kind of laid out that you're plotting through?
I mean, it really starts with 46 and Bill Jr. and kind of his swan song. Although I've yet to see any proof he's leaving the business at any certain time. But yeah, when he was getting ready to retire, that was his kind of, I'm going to make a bourbon before I leave. And the process, the wood finishing process, we wouldn't have chosen that. How Makers was created, our founders started with a taste vision, and all the choices they made along the way, some inherited, some very purposeful, like using wheat instead of rye, right? Got them to the taste vision that they wanted. And it wasn't hints of caramel with some Christmas cake. It wasn't that. Their taste vision was approachability, full flavored, round, harmony. Like, they wanted a bourbon for people who really didn't love bourbon at that time, and something you could sip on that you would be proud to share with your friends. Like, those were their dreams for what Makers became. And so when Bill Jr. created 46, his goal was to make a Maker's Mark for his palate. It was here's what I'll say. We're really bad about talking to ourselves at Maker's Mark. It can be good and bad. And so he wanted a bigger, bolder expression of Maker's Mark with a longer finish. That was his goal. The process that we decided on, nobody would have chosen French oak. It's really expensive. It's hard to source. The finishing, where we're coopering the barrels twice. It's labor intensive. It doesn't people don't understand it. They understand a double barrel. They don't understand the staves. None of it, we only made it in the winter time because of the tannin impact during the summer months. Like, there were all these weird things. but it worked because it tasted the way he wanted it to taste. And from that was born, it kind of opened this Pandora's box of, oh my gosh, look at all the flavor that exists in oak. And when you season it differently, and when you cook it differently, and when you apply these different heat treatments, like, oh my gosh. And so from there, you know, our single barrel program was born with Private Select. And the wood finishing series, honestly, Jay, it came out in a couple of different ways. We were learning all this stuff. We were tasting all these delicious whiskeys, and consumers were saying, we love this. This is fun. These, you know, having things to go taste and to explore and different expressions. And so we kind of thought, why not? I mean, it's whiskey. It's fun. So actually we planned the first 5 stories we wanted to tell before we ever did the first thing. The series is meant to be a storytelling series. The whiskeys are meant to have a strong point of view. I always say the worst thing you can say to me is they're fine. I would rather you be like, I hate this one. Because I think they're meant to be a little bit polarizing, and they're meant to push the flavor boundaries, and they're meant to go in some weird places. And with, you know, we've done 4 to date, and even internally, like Denny Potter and I have opposite palates, and we bicker and argue every day. And we're neighbors, so I get it oftentimes in the evenings as well. But yeah, oh gosh, we're bad about that. But it's fun. Go home and drink this whiskey and see how it translates to your house. Yeah, it's horrible. But yeah, I mean, we even debate internally. So it's really fun when we hear people kind of going back and forth about what they like, but we all like different things, right? If we all like the same thing, what a boring world that would be. So they've been so much fun. That was a really long answer to your question, by the way.
No, long answers are the best answers. They're, you know, there's nothing worse than asking what you think is this juicy, amazing question that's supposed to be open-ended, and then you get like, yes. And you're like, really? I gave you this whole canvas and you just painted with a tiny brush? No, I love it. I mean, and that's what's cool, right? And so many people come up and talk to John and I, and they're like, you know, why do you guys find these so interesting? It's the same base bourbon. Like, Maker's Mark puts so much effort and frankly, resources and manpower in to make sure that your base bourbon tastes as consistent as physically possible, to a level that, in my experience, no other distillery is really capturing. So it's cool to see that, like, oh, now they're going to release products that are supposed to taste different. Like, doesn't that go against the whole ethos? So the FAE-02, John and I have tasted it so far. What, you know, did you guys plan for FAE-01 and FAE-02 to release in the same year? Because previously you just did one a year. Are they supposed to kind of be like dueling bourbons?
They are. And there's a couple of years, I'm going to spoiler alert. There's a couple of years that you will see 2 versus 1. And it was really, again, us talking to ourselves and the story we wanted to tell. So here's the thing. All people know about these bourbons is, hey, it's a wood finishing series. It's got a weird stave name and it's cask strength. And here's some weird tasting notes. But they're all still makers, and they all are coming from things that we really care a lot about at Maker's Mark. So each whiskey has been inspired by a taste or flavor attribute that we feel is strongly represented in some of the things we do. So year 1, we wanted to make a whiskey that celebrated our yeast strain that we still propagate on site. Year 2, we wanted to celebrate the fact we still air dry all of our wood for our barrels to pull out tannins and degrade lignin and hemicellulose to get caramel and vanilla, right? People don't give a shit about that. We care about that. No one else cares. So this last year, FAE, I'm sure you all know this, stands for Fatty Acid Esters. And so one of the things that was really fun this year, we always knew we were going to be replacing one of our stills. So we have 3 sets of stills. They're identical. They're the same still design we've used since 1953. It's a 36-inch copper column still, 15 stripping trays, 1 rectifying section. It's a really small still considering how much bourbon we produce in the world. And people don't think about bourbon stills having characteristics the way Scotch does, but that's not true. They're just more efficient and more functional, and they're more consistent at the end of the day. But they still have nuances, and you're still creating distillates based on characteristics you want. So the fact that we have this small still, a lot of those fatty acid esters make it over into the distillate, and then we don't chill filter. So we leave them all right in the whiskey where they belong. Are we okay? Is this too much information? Should I keep going?
No, go deeper. Go.
Okay.
No, this is exactly what we want. Don't stop now.
So when we started mapping out, we wanted to make a whiskey to celebrate these things. Again, no one else cares about them. We care a lot about them, and they're things we've held on to for 67 years, which is just amazing. So when we started whiteboarding the taste vision of this whiskey a couple of years ago, we got into this huge debate about taste versus flavor, because flavor is just the flavor you're getting, right? It's very subjective. Taste is kind of how we define it, as the full experience, where you're not just tasting for flavor, it's texture, it's body, it's finish. I always laugh. I have a 5-year-old daughter. Flavor's one piece, but she cares way more about texture at this age. And so when you think about consuming whiskey, it's the full experience. So as we started mapping this out, those fatty acid esters are responsible for a lot of the great mouthfeel you get in Maker's Mark. So when we tried to start thinking, we decided, instead of cramming everything into one whiskey, let's have two. One that was truly flavor driven and one that was texture driven, which was really interesting. We had never created a whiskey with texture above flavor as we went to think about it. And that FAE-02, all of these wood finishings have been really challenging in different ways. When you're pursuing a taste vision, and I'm someone that in my brain, I know what it should taste like, or at least, but my brain and Denny's brain, we're not sharing a brain, and Beth's not sharing a brain. So you get in your head, this is what it's going to be, and you're just constantly redefining it. So there's different roads. Every whiskey's had a different journey. No two journeys of these whiskeys look the same.
That is awesome. I really so as we've tasted through these, the FAE-01 2, I really dig the textural difference between them. And there are any number of things in the world that Jay and I can nerd out over. Whiskey is obviously a priority. Food ends up being another. A subset of the food can sometimes be dessert. Gets discussed a little bit. I would sort of put this on a parallel of like having a, say, soft serve ice cream and a hard serve ice cream, like something that's a much higher milk fat content. You get so much more of that clinging to your palate flavor that just holds on, and texture will always increase a score for me when I'm rating whiskeys. Like if you can get something that's going to cling to the palate and bring a bold mouthfeel that just holds on, it's going to really elevate the experience, I think. And this is, it checks that box for sure.
What's so interesting about the FAE-02, and this was hard to do. So Denny and I argue about finish a lot. I like astringency. He hates it.
We do that.
John and I's entire relationship is me being like, too tannic, too bitter, and John being like, I love it, you know.
I don't like bitter, but I don't mind dryness. So like I love dark chocolate, and I love like the dry, dusty kind of bitter sweet finish. But like bitter I can't do. But it's interesting because finish is very debatable. And so it's so, John, it's so funny because when we did this, we wanted that big, fat, round mouthfeel, and that, but we wanted the finish. It's a long finish, but it's a very clean finish. Like it's not an astringent finish. And that, it was interesting. Like it was not easy to do. And because that was one of the things is we're like, we don't want clean finish is a Maker's Mark trademark. So, and some of these aren't. Some of the wood finishings go like, Bill Samuels Jr. hates bitter more than anyone I know. And sometimes he comes in for tastings and I get an earful. But that FAE-02 is an interesting one because it's got a pretty clean finish, even though it's long. I agree with you. It hangs on. And then the FAE-01 is just super funky in a good way, I think. So, but it's been our most polarizing to date.
Where do you guys start to balance the bringing in an older and potentially older and more finished product because makers have sort of hung their hat on, we bottle this when it's ready. Our whiskey is more or less perfect when we put it into the bottle and dunk it in wax. How do you then say it was perfect, but we're innovating and work with us? Like, what does that narrative look like internally to you guys?
We still think Makers is the best bourbon we can make. I think having different expressions to show different sides of the same bourbon is really fun. And it's been very rewarding, even for the base product. I've learned more about our brand in the last 5 years through doing these. I've come to appreciate the things we do every day to make Makers. I still, if you ask me what our best bourbon is, for me, it's our cask strength. I think it's the best product, and everything starts there. So, I think it goes back to your question, Jay, earlier about other than sales and the volume growth, like what's the most growth? And I think it's been that. And we've had to kind of feel our way through it because you're right. I was the girl that drank the Kool-Aid that this is the bourbon. We don't make a different bourbon. We don't make it. This is Maker's Mark. And then when 46 came out, I was like, how dare you? I mean, this was how, let me tell you a quick story. This is how committed and I work with multi-generational employees in a community of 400 people. I am never winning the homecoming queen of Maker's Mark. I am the least popular person at the distillery. But this is how much the employees have ownership of the brand. When Bill Jr. decided he was going to make what would eventually become Maker's 46, the first thing he did was he got everybody on board. So he didn't come in and say, we're making a new bourbon, get on board. That's not what happened. He called a meeting and he said, I want you all to sit down. I have something shocking to say. And I don't know if you know Bill Jr. He's out there and he's amazing, larger than life. So the fact that he thought it was shocking, everybody was like, oh my God, what's he going to say? So we sit down, there's about 9 of us in this meeting, and he says, it's time to make a new bourbon. And there was this audible groan that went around the table. And nobody was excited, right? You would think like, oh my God, we're going to do something new. I was in Europe going into the Ritz going, hi, Ritz-Carlton, here's Maker's Mark. And if they say, I don't like it, all I can do is go, well, nice to meet you. Thank you. I don't have anything else. Like, this is all I have. And so he was like, God damn it. Stop talking for a minute. Let me just tell you, so we're sitting there and he goes, last week I had this horrible nightmare. And I apologize if you guys have heard this story before, but he says, I had this horrible nightmare that I died. And I came back to my own funeral as a ghost. We're like, okay, Bill, we're with you. And he says, I'm at the graveside and we're outside. It's a beautiful day and we're getting ready to lower my casket into the ground. And everybody's already walking off and making plans. And my wife, Nancy's, talking about heading to Florida with cocktails on the plane, which I could totally see her doing that. But he's like, nobody cared. He goes, and while I'm standing there, my tombstone pops up. And it starts self-scribing. And it says, here lies Bill Samuels Jr. He didn't fuck it up. And he said, and I woke up in this cold sweat, and I apologize if you have to bleep out my language. But he's like, I woke up in this cold sweat, and I thought, my only legacy can't be that I screwed up my mom and dad's bourbon. And so we all went, oh, Bill, like you've done so much for the industry. And if you want to make a bourbon, you deserve to make, we're like, he's getting pretty old. Like we should support this. Total bullshit. He made the whole thing up. He did not have the dream. Never happened. He knew he had to get the leadership team on board to believe in what he wanted to go do. So he didn't try to ram it down. He manipulated us a little bit, but he wanted to get everybody truly on board with the idea. And from there, it was 2 years of development and work to get to it. But I always think like it's never been this is what we're going to go do. It's a lot of conversation. There's a core innovation team that, at the core, it's Rob Samuels and myself. And then over the years, there have been others, but it really is us coming together and saying what feels right for the brand, what still honors Bill and Margie's vision. And, because they were pioneers. I think we made one thing for so long because, again, there just wasn't a need. But anyway, thanks for indulging with that story. It stays with me to this day.
That's awesome. One of those priceless moments.
I was recently on premise at Maker's Mark doing up to some shenanigans. And you guys, this is one of the years you were replacing your still. So, old still was out in the parking lot. I'm curious, what goes into the process of actually bringing online a new still? Do you guys, I believe you do it fairly routine, but I'm curious, is there a run book? Is it a lot of work, or do you just pop that baby in and run it? What's the deal?
It's a lot of work. It's probably about every 15 years you replace the trays every 7 to 8, depending on how worn out they are, how hard you've been running the stills. So like I said, this one had been planned for a while. We had our third still installed in 2015. And that one's still, it just, no matter when they're made exactly the same, there's always some interesting kinks with a new still. So that one got put in this last shutdown in August. It's running great. We run 24/7, 48 weeks a year. But it just, it's fresh copper, it's fresh everything. It takes a little while for it to get acclimated is the best way I know how to say it. So, where right now still one's probably my favorite, if I'm allowed to say that. And then still 3 is doing pretty well. Still 2, we're figuring out what's going on. So, even though they're identical, it's still getting into the place, getting the still settled, running it. So in the beginning, you don't do as consistent runs. You're kind of shutting it down to clean it a little more often just to kind of get it worked in. So, but they're identical. Vendome, as soon as they put a new one in, they build us another and they store it until just in case. So we always have a still ready to go.
Man, that is an enviable place to be. At some point in my life, I hope that I am in possession of a just-in-case still. Because, to me, that's really making it. But this has been an absolute pleasure. I love the depth. I love the creativity and the passion and the innovation that Makers has for bourbon, especially because I think about it every time, like I mentioned, someone's up and Makers taste the same. And I'm and it takes a lot of work to make that happen. So for our friends... who are asking, for anyone who's looking for more information about Makers, where they can find your products, where should they go to look for more information? Do you guys have a list? Do you send out info on your limited editions? Where can people get the goods?
I would check with your favorite local liquor stores on, some of the more limited offerings. Makers, you should be able to find everywhere, which I love that about Maker's Mark. And then just for more information, you guys seem to know more about our website, honestly, than I do. So you probably can share more on that. But yeah, I think checking with your favorite liquor store is always a great way to because every state's distribution's different, time it takes to get to market's different. So sometimes if by the time you read about it, even on our website, it's already, you control states are quick up there in Maine. You guys do stuff very quickly. Where open states take longer sometimes. It just depends.